how should one conduct oneself when the minyan for Arvit begins before Tzeit HaKochavim, the appearance of 3 stars?
The first thing to understand regarding this question is how this situation came about in the first place. In other words, why is it the fact that many minyanim throughout the Jewish world, both in Israel and overseas, many minyanim for Arvit in the evening begin well before Tzeit HaKochavim, the appearance of 3 stars. And it is necessary to understand further that what we loosely term as Arvit or Tefilat Arvit, in other words, the evening service or the evening prayer, or Ma'ariv, these are all synonymous terms. What we loosely refer to by these terms, in fact, consists of 2 separate mitzvot. The first mitzvah is that of Kriyat Shema, the reading of particular parshiot, portions from the Torah, with certain barachot that were instituted by the Chachamim to be said with those parshiot. That is the first mitzvah. The second thing that we must understand is that which we usually refer to loosely as Tefilat Arvit or Ma'ariv, the evening service or the evening prayer, consists in fact of 2 separate parts, 2 separate mitzvot. One mitzvah is that of Kriyat Shema, and the second is the mitzvah of Tefilat Arvit. When I say Tefilat Arvit, I refer to what we normally refer to as the Shemona Esrei, the Tefilat Amidah. This is the part that is correctly referred to as Tefillah, because the word Tefillah always refers, strictly speaking, to the Shemona Esrei Berachot, the Tefillah recited whilst standing, therefore also called Tefilat Ha'amidah, which consists of 18 Berachot, the Shemona Esrei Berachot. And that is referred to as Tefillah. And the same is true of Shaharit and Minha. When we say Tefilat Shaharit, strictly speaking, we are referring to the Shemona Esrei, not everything that is associated with it, not to Birkot HaShahar or Pesukei de Zimra or Kriyat Shema. These are all separate units which we, for different reasons, string together, which we tend to recite one after the other. But in fact, the word tefillah refers to one thing only, and that is the prayer, that is the actual Shemona Esrei Berachot. And the same is true, therefore, for Arvit. Kriyat Shema, on the other hand, is a separate mitzvah. And the real question, therefore, becomes, both with regards to Shaharith and Arvit, the morning and the evening prayer, because Shema is recited twice a day, in the morning and in the evening, which is to come first, the Shema or the Tefillah? Is there a specific order? How is it supposed to work? As we all know, we have the concept of Nismoch Geula Lithfilah, that is to say, to recite the Shema with its associated brachot, Birkot Kriyat Shema, which ends with Birkat Geula. That's why it's called Geula L'Tfilah, to recite Shema first, which ends with the bracha of Geula, and then Nismoch Geula L'Tfilah, and then immediately to follow that with the Tefillah, with the Shemona Esrei. This is what we do in the morning and also in the evening. On the other hand, if we take into account the fact that the Zaman, the time, the halachic time for reciting the Arvit prayer, Tefilat Arvit, the Shemona Esrei, and the Zaman for reciting Shema is not one and the same time, then we have to ask ourselves, can these things be done together? Can they be juxtaposed? Because really, one may, l'chatchila, in other words, not just when it is one is pressed for certain reasons, but without any reservation, one may lichatchila pray the evening prayer, the Tefillat Arvit, the Shemona Esrei, from the moment that the sun sets, immediately after Shki'at HaHama. That is the Zaman for Arvit lichatchila, as opposed to Kriyat Shema, where the Zaman is only from Tzeit HaKochavim, from the appearance of 3 stars, which takes place sometime after the sun sets. How long after depends on one's geographical location and also on the season, the time of the year. In Eretz Yisrael, on an average day, the time that elapses between Shki'at HaHama, sunset, and Tzeit HaKochavim, the appearance of 3 stars in the sky, is approximately 20 minutes. In the middle of summer, it's approximately 30 minutes. And in the middle of winter, it's considerably less than 20 minutes. And in other parts of the world, of course, these times change and vary greatly. Historically, in the evening, what we call today Tefillat Arvit, loosely, was done actually in 2 stages. In other words, first, people would come to the Beit Knesset, to the synagogue, in the evening. When I say evening, I mean immediately after the sun sets, for a number of reasons. First of all, because that was the end of the working day. Of course, when there is no artificial lighting, then work naturally ends with the going down of the sun. People would gather in the Beit Knesset, they would recite the evening prayer, that is to say the Shemona Esrei Berachot, and they would go home before it got too dark. Again, because one did not walk about when it was completely dark outside. It was not very often, it was not safe for various reasons. And Kriyat Shema was recited by every individual in his home, usually immediately before going to sleep, which, generally speaking, again, for reasons connected to the lack of artificial lighting and the rhythm of life in those times, people went to sleep rather early compared to nowadays, perhaps. Kriyat Shema, on the other hand, was recited by the individual in his home, usually immediately before going to sleep. People tended to go to sleep rather early. Again, there was no artificial lighting, or certainly not the kind of lighting to which we are used today, and therefore the home was fairly dark. They did have candles, true, but people were not very active at night. People went to sleep rather early. They recited Kriyat Shema with the Berachot immediately before going to sleep, and that was the end of the day. And that was the order of things in ancient times. When I say ancient times, I mean up until the period of, at the earliest, the period of the Amoraim. When I say the period of the Amoraim, I mean the 3rd, 4th, and even 5th centuries, Leminyanam, according to the Christian calendar. This original practice we find mentioned explicitly in the name of Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, who was one of the greatest Hachamim of the intermediate generation between the Tanaim and the Amoraim, or some would count him as one of the first oldest members, more senior members of the first generation of the Amoraim. In his name, the view is expressed in the Talmud Bavli in Masechet Berachot Daf Daled, that Tefilot ba'imsa' tikenu, which means that the 3 tefilot of the day, Shaharith, Minha, and Arvit, morning, afternoon, and evening prayer, the Shemona Esrei, these are to be recited ba'imsa', in the middle, that is to say, between the 2 Kriyot Shema, between the Kriyat Shema in the morning. In other words, Kriyat Shema in the morning, b'Shaharith, precedes the Tefillah, the Shemona Esrei, And in the evening, it is the reverse. The tefillah is said first, and Kriyat Shema is said later. This was the ancient practice, as described by Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. This is also what we find explicitly in the beginning of the Talmud Yerushalmi in Masechet Berachot. This is the practice that is presented there, that Shema was not recited in the Beit Knesset, in the synagogue, before Tefillah, with the Berachot, with the aim of performing that mitzvah of Kriyat Shema. It was recited at home by the individual. This historical reality began to change over time, in accordance with the view expressed by Rabbi Yohanan, who is mentioned there in that same passage in the Talmud, Masechet Berachot Daf Daled, where Rabbi Yohanan is quoted as saying, "Ezahu ben ha'olam haba," who is certainly worthy of having a significant place in the world to come. That is to say, who is considered a pious individual. That is an expression, a way of saying who is considered a pious individual. For example, someone zeh hasomech geula shel arvith letfilah shel arvith, someone who recites the Shema before the tefillah of arvith. We see clearly from this statement of Rabbi Yohanan that this was not the standard practice. He refers to it as being something that a pious person, someone who is considered a ben ha'olam haba, that is to say a particularly pious individual, such a person would behave in such a way, would make a point of reciting Shema with the brachot immediately before Arvith. But this was not what everybody was doing. Had this been the case, he would not have been able to express himself in that way. And it is clear that Rabbi Yohanan was not describing the standard practice, that is to say what most people were doing, but that which certain individuals, certain yehidim, yehidei segula one could add, particularly noteworthy Hasidim, pious individuals who had their own way of doing things, not the path trodden by the rabbim, by the majority, by the simple or the average person. Such people would make a point of reciting Shema first before the tefillah. And why was this so important? Because this was a way of focusing one's mind and increasing one's kavanah, one's devotion and concentration before the tefillah, just as it is in the morning. And this was considered therefore a very positive thing. So for a person who could do so, Rabbi Yohanan was very much in favor of such a practice. But Rabbi Yohanan must have known, without doubt, that this is not what everybody was doing. Obviously, Rabbi Yohanan, who lived in Eretz Yisrael his whole life, clearly he knew exactly what was done, what was the standard minhag and practice in Eretz Yisrael, as described in the Talmud Yerushalmi. And therefore it follows that Rabbi Yohanan's statement does not refer to what every individual did or should do even, but rather that which individuals who for different reasons would not pray in the synagogue, in the Beit Knesset with the public or the majority of people who had their own way of worshipping Hashem, their own seder yom, their own schedule. Such people could make a point of waiting a little bit longer till the appearance of 3 stars, till Tzeit HaKochavim, and then they could recite the Shema with the brachot and immediately follow this with the Shema. And this did not necessarily have to be, therefore, either at the very beginning of the evening. It could be done at a later point in the evening. Something which we also see mentioned in the Talmud Yerushalmi, that often Talmidei Chachamim would study well into the night, probably much later than most people were awake, and then they would recite Kriyat Shema before going to sleep later at night. Rabbi Yohanan, with regards to such a person, says if a person can recite the Shema and then say the Tefillah, that is an ideal way of performing these mitzvot, because that is maximizing the possibility of having the best possible kavanat halev, the best chance of focusing and concentrating on one's tefillah properly in the evening. What happened subsequently was that over time this suggestion of Rabbi Yohanan became the standard practice, particularly apparently in Bavel, in Babylon, less so in Eretz Yisrael, at least originally. However, for the reasons that we explained before, because the end of the workday was when the sun set or was about to set, and people wanted to gather in the Beth Knesset, recite the tefillah, and go home as soon as possible before it got completely dark outside. Therefore, these realities, these facts of life, meant that people were gathering in the Beth Knesset at the same time as before, and they were not about to wait another 20 minutes or half an hour in order to pray in the evening. And therefore, it began to be the common reality, although it's not an ideal reality, that the people would recite both Kriyat Shema and the Tefillah before the appearance of 3 stars, before Tzeit HaKochavim, because of those constraints that we explained. And therefore, it became the common reality, and also therefore a very widespread problem, that people were reciting Shema before the proper time for reciting Shema. And therefore this is discussed by all the Geonim and all the Rishonim. Why is this the case? And also therefore what to do? Seeing that this is the case, what is one to do in order to fulfill one's obligation, in order to be Yosef the Hova of Kriyat Shema? And we do not need to look very far to see that all the Rishonim are dealing with this issue, this problem, because it is a problem. The fact that most people are saying Kriyat Shema in the Beth Knesset before Tzeit HaKochavim, in other words, before the time, the beginning of the time, the Zaman for Kriyat Shema, as explained, as stated clearly in the Mishnah and in the Talmud, at the beginning of both Talmudim, at the beginning of Masechet Berachot. Everyone knew that this was the reality, and therefore we find in Rashi, at the very beginning of the Masechet, Rashi says that if one reads Kriyat Shema before this time, one is not Yoseh the Hova. Rashi writes, HaKoreh kodem lochen lo yasa yedeh hovatho. And therefore he says, Ulefichach hova alenu likrotha mishetachshach. And therefore we are required to say Kriyat Shema after nightfall, in other words, Tzeit HaKochavim. And then Rashi adds, Uvi Kriyat parasha rishona shadam koreh al mitotho yasa. And therefore Rashi stresses that, seeing that the fact is that people are reciting Kriyat Shema in the Beth Knesset before the Zaman, Rashi points out that it is also the practice, it is also correct and necessary for a person to read Kriyat Shema before going to sleep, immediately before going to sleep. That which is referred to as Kriyat Shema al Hamita, literally Shema in bed, reading Kriyat Shema when one enters one's bed at night. If one reads the first parasha only, which as is mentioned in the Talmud Bavli and Masechet Berachot Daf Samech, and with the reading of one parasha, one is making the miswa of Kriyat Shema. So says Rashi. Rashi needs to say this and to make this point precisely because of the reality, which was that Kriyat Shema was being recited and Tefillat Arvit was being performed in the Beth Knesset before Tzeit HaKochavim. And it is also entirely clear that this issue did not present itself for the first time in Rashi's days, but rather this was the reality going back centuries. We find a number of the Geonim dealing with this issue as well. For example, on page 2 of Osar HaGeonim, which collects most of the statements of the Gaonim on the various issues according to the order of the Talmud, we find the following question was addressed to Rav Hai Gaon, the last of the Gaonim, who lived approximately 100 years before Rashi. וששאלתם, ציבור דמסלו תפילת ערבית וקרוא קריאת שמע קודם צאת הכוכבים. Your question regarding a community which recites both the tefillah of Arvith and reads Kriyat Shema before Tzeit HaKochavim, ולא יחיל עינה של עקובינהו, and no one is able to prevent this from happening. No one can convince them that they should wait half an hour or so. איזה מהן עדיף? What should one do? What is the preferable course of action? This is the question. דליסלה עינש בהדה סיבורה 18 ברכות, that a person, should a person choose to pray Arvith, that is to say the 18 with the Sibur in the Beit Knesset, ושווה קריאת שמע וברכות שלפניה ושלאחריה עד צאת הכוכבים, and to delay reciting Kriyat Shema with the brachot before and after, until after Tzeit HaKochavim. In other words, not to decide lechatchila not to be somech gura litfila, which is not what Rabbi Yochanan was suggesting, or la'kuveh ad Tzeit HaKochavim, or rather to wait till Tzeit HaKochavim to perform both of these mitzvot, Kriyat Shema and Tefillah, u'mitparel biyahid u'somech gura litfila k'Rabbi Yochanan. And therefore, or alternatively, not to pray with the Sibur, either not to go to the Beit Knesset at all, or to be there and engage in some other activity whilst the Sibur is praying, such as studying Torah, just to be there, to be part of the Sibur, or to answer Kaddish or what have you. But to actually pray later by oneself, recite Kriyat Shema in its proper time, and also therefore be Somech Gura L'Tfilah. What should one prefer to do? So this was the question asked of Rav Hai Gaon. What is the preferred course of action? The answer he gives is as follows. Rabbanan de Eretz Yisrael, the Chachamim, the Talmidei Chachamim in Eretz Yisrael, in his day, Hachen Avadin, this is what they do. In other words, this is not a new question. This is a well-known reality. And this is what the Hachamim in Eretz Yisrael do. The implication here is perhaps that in Bavel, the situation was somewhat different. Possibly in Bavel at this time, of Rav Hai Gaon at least, it had been possible to convince many of the communities, many of the Jews, to delay Arvith till after Tzeit HaKochavim. Although, frankly, to me, this would be surprising that someone was able to actually change this reality. And from what we see in all the Rishonim, in the generations following Rav Hai Gaon and following Rashi, we see that this issue was very real and present. So it doesn't seem that this was the overall reality. But apparently this time in Bavel, this was less of an issue, possibly. So Rav Hai Gaon says, in Eretz Yisrael, this is what the Chachamim do. Maslo shel Arvith, they daven Arvith with the Sibur, uvathar hacheh karo Kriyat Shema bizmana, and they do not say Kriyat Shema at that point in the Beit Knesset, and they later recite Kriyat Shema. V'la ichpaf laho nismach gula letfilah be'Arvith, and they are not concerned about samichut gula letfilah in Arvith as much as this is desirable at Shaharith. It is less of an issue at the time of Arvith. So says Rav Hai Gaon. Wa'anan, and we believe, we hold, Hacheh Hazana, this is what we understand, the Kriyat Shema bo'nathat tafeh adif. Reciting Kriyat Shema with the brachot at its proper time is preferable to smichut gula letfilah. That is the response in brief of Rav Hai Gaon, and this teshuvah is quoted by a number of the Rishonim. For example, the Rosh at the beginning of Masechet Berachot, Siman Aleph, he quotes this teshuvah. He writes, "V'sha'alu mirav Haizal לעניין ציבור שמתפללים ערבית, he quotes this very same question. וקוראים שמע קודם צאת הכוכבים. Rabbi Gaon was asked about places where Arvith is recited before Tzeit HaKochavim, what should one do? And he says, Hishiv, this was his response. Ba'eretz Yisrael osim ken. This is what is done in Eretz Yisrael. We saw that in the original form of the Teshuvah of Rabbi Gaon, he refers to the Chachamim. In other words, the common people perhaps knew less, and sometimes also, unfortunately, perhaps cared less about whether they were doing everything in the precisely correct manner. But the Talmidei Chachamim certainly understood, and this is what they did, and they would, as we read, they would say Arvith, the Tefillah, by itself in the Beit Knesset, and they would read Kriyat Shema later. So quotes the Rosh. So the Rosh also endorses this position. So we need to take note of the fact that we find before us two positions amongst the Rishonim. Rav Hai Gaon and also the Rosh, and we will see presently other Rishonim as well, state, unlike Rashi, that if faced with this reality, one should choose l'chatchila not to recite Kriyat Shema with the Sibur in the Beit Knesset before Tzeit HaKochavim. One should just recite the Tefillah, the Shmoneh Esrei Barachot, in order to be omed b'tefillah mitoch divrei Torah, in order to pray, having studied some Torah or focused one's mind in the correct manner. One can study any type of Talmud Torah, etc., in order to have kavanat halev, to have proper intention and a focused mind. And Kriyat Shema should be recited later. And Samichut Gura Tefillah is less an issue. It is certainly not a sufficiently powerful reason to recite Kriyat Shema before its proper time. Kriyat Shema, of course, is a chova, whereas, as we have explained, Samichut Gula Shel Arvith, Tefillah Shel Arvith, is not a chova. In actual fact, it is a midat hasiduth. So, responded Rav Hai Gaon. He also said that this was the practice of the Talmidei Chachamim in Eretz Yisrael. One imagines this was the practice for even centuries. And this was echoed by the Rosh and a number of other Rishonim, as we shall see. This is not the position of Rashi. Rashi essentially accepts this reality, which is imperfect, and he admits as much. But Rashi says, with the avad, given this reality, it is sufficient that a person says Kriyat Shema Alamita and recites the first parasha of Shema, and in this fashion one is Yoseh the Chova, and this in practice is what we see, despite what we read in Rav Hai Gaon and the Rosh. This is what we see most of the Kehilot in this period of history, certainly, and in my experience this is also the case down to the present day. In many communities, Arvith is recited before Tzeit HaKochavim, particularly in the summer months, but not necessarily only in the summer. In many places this is often the case throughout the year. This position of Rashi is quoted explicitly by the Reed, Rabbeinu Yeshayahu Ditrani, in his Psakim at the beginning of Barachot, and he says regarding Rashi's solution, so to speak, Ve'eno nir'eli, this does not seem correct to me. Likro Kriyat Shema b'vilchotea kodem zmana, to recite Kriyat Shema with the brachot before the proper time, before Tzeit HaKochavim, v'la'asot bracha levatala. Here we hear explicitly from the Reed that in his view, reciting the brachot of Kriyat Shema before Zaman Kriyat Shema is in fact a bracha levatala. It is not the case that all Rishonim agree with this position. We have, for example, a Teshuvah of the Rashba, where he claims in the name of some of the Geonim that if one recites Birkot Kriyat Shema after the Shki'ah, in other words, as long as it is no longer clearly day and the sun is no longer shining or no longer visible, that one may recite the brachot, and it's not a bracha levatala, even though, seeing that the stars have not yet appeared, one is not performing the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema at that point. But the Reed is obviously not of this opinion. The Reed holds that reciting Birkot Kriyat Shema before the Zaman is a bracha levatala. By the way, this is also the position of the Gra, apparently, or at least we find explicitly mentioned in Ma'aseh Rav and other sources, and this is quoted also in the Mishnah Berurah or the Biur Halacha, that in the Gra's view, if the Sibur davens early, it is better to daven alone in order to say everything in its proper time and to be somech gula litfila. And this is exactly what the Reed says also, because the Reed says, Ela nachon be'inai, the correct thing to do in this situation is la'aher ad Tzeit HaKochavim, to wait till Tzeit HaKochavim, ulikro Kriyat Shema v'vichoteh, ulitpalel, and then to recite Kriyat Shema with the brachot and to recite the tefillah. And therefore, if the Sibur is doing differently, this means therefore that one does not daven with the Sibur. So one can be in the Beit Knesset and be involved in some other activity, as we said, or one can simply not be there at all. This is what the Reed tells us. And it is clear that this too is the position of the Rambam. Rambam writes in Ilchot Tefillah Perek Shelishi Halacha Zayin, with regards to reciting a tefillah before its time, the usual time. Rambam says, with regards to tefillah Leil Shabbat or Mosai Shabbat, it is possible to daven Arvith early. Rambam says, V'yeshlo lehitpalel tefillah Arvith. Yeshlo means one may pray Arvith shelele Shabbat be'erev Shabbat kodem shetishka hashemesh. One may say tefillah Arvith for Leil Shabbat before the setting of the sun on Friday afternoon, late Friday afternoon. And one may do the same thing at the end of Shabbat. The tefillah of Mosai Shabbat one may recite before sunset on the day of Shabbat. But Rambam adds, and this is on condition that the person recites Kriyat Shema in its proper time, ahar Tzeit HaKochavim. So we see clearly that Rambam allows one to recite on certain occasions, as we saw with regards to Shabbat, a tefillah before its usual time. Specifically, he's referring to Arvith. But it never occurred to Rambam that one would also recite Kriyat Shema before its proper time, in order to be somech gulat tefillah. So when Rambam says one may recite tefillat Arvith before the sun sets, before Shekiat Hama on Friday, Erev Shabbat, it is clear to him that one is not reciting Kriyat Shema at that time. And this is also what the Rosh writes with regards to this halacha of reciting Arvith early before the actual beginning of Shabbat. That Rav, who is reported to have acted in this way, obviously read Kriyat Shema later. So says the Rosh again at the beginning of Masechet Berachot. So the maskana, the conclusion, therefore, must be, based on what we have seen, based on all the explicit sources, that when one is faced with this option, one may either choose to recite Tefillat Arvith by itself with the Sibur in the Beit Knesset, whereas Kriyat Shema will be recited later after Tzeit HaKochavim, in which case one is not being somech gula shel Arvith l'tefillah shel Arvith, but this is not a major concern because we are discussing a midat Hasiduth. Or alternately, one may recite all of the tefillah, that is to say Kriyat Shema with the brachot, and afterwards somech gula l'tefillah and recite tefillat Arvith b'yehiduth, as mentioned by some of the Rishonim and the Gra. Either of these two possibilities is open before a person who is dealing with such a situation. This is a practical halacha because this is a commonplace reality, and we have to therefore discuss and know exactly how we should behave in such a situation. We can also mention here that the Talmud Yerushalmi makes no mention at all of Rabbi Yohanan's suggestion, the Midat Hasiduth of being Somech Gula Shel Arvith Litfila Shel Arvith, it seems that this was not an accepted position in Eretz Yisrael, even for Yehidim to behave in such a way. It was the ancient practice, as we have explained, as mentioned by Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. It was the ancient practice to recite Kriyat Shema at night, after Tzeit HaKochavim, at home, frequently, but not always before going to sleep, but it could also be sometime before going to sleep. And this ancient practice was apparently, it was felt that this was not to be altered, and it was not mentioned, therefore, in the Talmud Yerushalmi at all. So according to the Talmud Yerushalmi, one may lechatchila choose to behave in this fashion.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.